Welcome back. Well, let's crack straight on with our next guest, Labour's Shadow Attorney General, Baroness Chakrabarti. Thanks very much for being with us in the studio this morning. Now, before we go on to Brexit and other issues, I'm keen to get your reaction to the news that our city editor, Mark Kleiman, broke yesterday, that Nissan is planning to cancel production of its X-Trail model in Sunderland. Concerning news.
It's very, very troubling. That is a region that does not need more uncertainty, turmoil. And when something like that happens, you have to think not just about the potential jobs in that industry, in that region. You have to think about the whole supply chain too. And it's places like Sunderland that have really, really suffered for years, actually, since the crash. It's places like that we need to look to when we're looking at, you know, in a sense, the causes of the Brexit vote. Obviously, it's not for me to speculate until Nissan makes its announcement about the precise reasons, but they've, I think, in recent times already moved battery manufacture and R&D. You know, we're looking perhaps to lose, you know, vital infrastructure to places like China, but also to parts of the EU like France. It's really troubling.
Is there anything that the government should be doing?
I think that it needs to end uncertainty in many respects, in particular the no-deal Brexit scenario. I don't want to make everything about Brexit because, you know, as you discussed earlier with Vince Cable, there are other issues in car manufacturing. But the no-deal Brexit is an uncertainty that's completely unacceptable for all sorts of people: farmers, car manufacturers, consumers. The government needs to absolutely take that off the table. I don't think that the House of Commons will tolerate a no-deal Brexit. So Theresa May needs to stop running down the clock and using that terrible threat as some kind of bargaining chip with the EU.
I mean, the easiest way to take no deal off the table is to get a deal through.
Yeah.
Is it time for Labour to drop some of its red lines and actually look to make a compromise and get a deal?
Well, you know that Jeremy Corbyn went in last week to speak to Theresa May, and I know that he's been criticised in the past for not speaking to her earlier, but it was because he wanted no deal off the table and then to be able to talk about what kind of a deal might get the support of the House of Commons.
But you can't take no deal off the table, can you, until you've got the basis of some kind of deal? I mean,
well,
surely it's Labour who can actually take no deal off the table by trying to get a deal.
You know, what Jeremy Corbyn and Theresa May have begun to discuss are our priorities, which we think are closer to the priorities that would command support across the House of Commons. So that's a customs union.
OK, well, let's talk about customs union, which is what Labour often say, you know, permanent customs union is what you want. At the same time, though, the backstop has an effective customs union in it, and at the minute we haven't negotiated the future relationship. So why don't you vote for the withdrawal agreement and get that through, which already has a customs union in it, and then argue for the customs union afterwards?
Because you have to have some vision of where you're going before you jump.
That's the EU sequencing, isn't it? You have to get the divorce done before the future relationship.
Yeah, but you know, most likely with a Labour version of the future relationship, the backstop would be much less of an issue. You know, the reason for the backstop is because the EU, like Labour, will not countenance a hard border on the island of Ireland.
But the backstop will be there regardless, won't it?
There's probably
under Labour's plan as well.
There's probably the need now, given where we are and the timing, for some kind of insurance policy or backstop. But the point is, we have less of a problem and less uncertainty about the future because we want that customs union. We want that close relationship on regulatory alignment, on a customs union, on a strong single market relationship, which would mean that there wouldn't have to be this divergence, which is what creates the conflict around the backstop.
OK. Now, there's been some criticism of Labour MPs this week who voted for the deal or have signalled that they could vote for the deal in return, potentially, for some more money for their constituencies. Now, if those constituencies voted to leave the EU and they are in need of more investment, isn't that a win-win?
No, I don't think it's a win-win. And by the way, I don't believe in the end that any Labour MP would really be fooled by, you know, what some people have called a bribe and so on. And that's not because Labour constituencies like vast parts of the country aren't desperate for more investment, it's because you can't just pick constituencies off in that sort of very narrow way. We need investment across regions, across the country, whether it's on things like research and development, whether it's regional
Some investment's better than
investment.
none, though, isn't it?
Look, I get that. I just do not believe that Labour voters and the most left behind constituencies would thank their MPs for these short-term, isolated bribes. I just don't see that commanding public confidence and support. When you think about how disenchanted so many people have been with politics and politicians in recent years, the idea that that would be reversed by this kind of pork barrel politics, I just don't see it.
OK, well, let's talk about something else that could potentially cause disenchantment in politics, which is a second referendum. We spoke about it with Vince Cable earlier, and I'm keen to get your thoughts on it as well. So last week on the show, I just want to show you what your shadow cabinet colleague Angela Rayner said. She said, if we end up with a second referendum, then us as politicians have failed the public. Do you agree with that?
I think she's got a point. I think she's got a point. You know, personally, I'm very, very sceptical about referenda in general because of this binary yes, no, in, out kind of approach that doesn't deal with nuances and complexities and what kind of Brexit and what kind of EU, what kind of relationship. And so we had this referendum a few years ago. We didn't have even a qualified majority for that level of constitutional change, just a simple majority. And look what happened. This completely divisive, divided result. Mrs May said she was going to heal the country. She called her election that she didn't need to call. It hasn't healed the country. I think Angela has a point. You know, and as I've said and other people have said, if you have a second referendum and you get the same result or a slightly different result, this time it's 52-48 the other way, what happens next?
So it could be more divisive, you think, if we have another referendum?
It could be. I mean, I can't say, we can't rule it out altogether, because if you have to break the stalemate, I personally would prefer a general election. Now, you might say, well, you would say that, wouldn't you? That's self-serving. But it's just that in a general election, you get to talk about other things. You get to have nuance. You get to talk about social care and education and manufacturing, investment, and so on and so forth, things that you don't get to talk about in a simple in-out, yes, no, black, white
Well, you might get
referendum.
your election if reports in the Mail on Sunday or anything to go by. They say that Theresa May's pencil won in for June.
Well, do you know, I hope so. And I say to her, you did it when you didn't need to do it, and now you've been in stasis. The country is effectively not being governed. All sorts of other desperately important issues are not being dealt with.
So why aren't Labour doing better in the polls then? Because if people don't like Theresa May, then they must be looking at you guys and thinking, oh, I don't want them either.
I think partly, let's be honest, Labour is a party of Leave and Remain. It's not a party just of Leave or just of Remain. What unites Labour, whether it's party members or MPs or voters, is a belief in social justice. And if all the energy and all the debate and all the commentary and all the Sunday morning TV is always about Brexit, sometimes it's hard to cut through with the kind of issues that helped us in the general election campaign. That is an issue. But we've done, we've not done it. I mean, we can argue about polls and, a poll of polls and how many you've done slightly better or slightly worse in the last 8. The most important poll of all is the official democratic one, which is a general election.
Now, before we go, I'm interested to get your thoughts on Venezuela. We've seen people taking to the streets again, in support of both the president and the opposition leader. What's your take on what's happening and how the international community should react?
So here's the thing. When I'm not an expert in a particular region, like South America, I go to my trusted sources for the picture. And for me, as a human rights campaign, my trusted sources have always been Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. And I would say this to your viewers, it's always a good place to start when you want to know what might be happening in a country. And last year's reporting on Venezuela are pretty damning. And that's in terms of disappearances, that's in terms of crushing dissent, that's in terms of reports of torture of prisoners and political prisoners, and it's completely unacceptable. And I think it is incumbent on people like me, you know, as someone of the left, to call out governments and states of the left, because human rights have to be applied with an even hand. Now,
Should Jeremy Corbyn have been tougher then, do you think, in his statements on Maduro?
Well, I think that I think Jeremy is a lifelong human rights defender, but of course sometimes it's difficult for him to cut through in the media, because people just say, well, you're a socialist, just like the Venezuelans.
But I'm talking about his public statements, you know, the last couple of weeks.
Well, he has said that you have to have the rule of law and you have to have human rights. And clearly, if you match that with the reporting of the situation in Venezuela, that's not happening. However, and I do have to say this, it would be very helpful if the United States and the UK Conservative government would, yes, of course, call out Venezuela, but also look across the way at Honduras, where you have a US-backed government that is also crushing dissent. I think that this kind of human rights defence on the planet only works when we're all applying these standards with an even hand, whether it's Saudi Arabia, whether it's Israel-Palestine, whether it's Venezuela, whether it's Honduras. And if we start applying these values with an eye to oil or regime change, then, you know, we're always on a pretty sticky wicket, I think, and we don't make things better.
OK, we're out of time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.